You're listening to DruidCast episode 205. Hello my friends and welcome to DruidCast episode 205. I am your host Dave the Bard, and DruidCast is brought to you on or around the 20th of the month by the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids. If you want to find out more about the Order and our courses, you can do that at our website, which is at druidry.org. Opening the show, you heard Skúdarinka Wassail by Raven Hymn from their new EP, a glorious sound of folk metal playing on DruidCast. Awesome. I met the band at a Beltane event this year, a great live band, and thank you so much for sending that into the show. Good luck with the EP. The talky bit this month is a recording of a talk given by Moss Mathy at this year's Wild Witchcraft Conference titled German Dragon Spirits. Now, as with the other recorded talks, it was recorded live in the room, and I've done my best to treat the audio to make the sound more clear. It worked, but in some places it's better than others. But it was a fabulous and interesting talk, so very much deserves a place on the show to bring it to your ears. So, my friends, grab your cuppa and enjoy this month's Talky Bit.
The Talky Bit.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So, as Jonathan just said, I'm Moss, the person, not the plant. People sometimes get confused, but I'm a lot taller. And I'm talking today about German dragon spirits, which I'm doing specifically because I'm German. And I can't get to the laptop to do my slides, so I've got my glamorous assistant down here, who every now and again will bump up there and do a slide when I shout at him. So hopefully it'll all work. So this is me, and this is me. I just put another picture there in case it helped. And as I said, I'm German. I'm also Welsh. I moved here when I was quite young, and now I'm a member of the Southwest Golf Coven with Maura Starling, with Matthew, my lovely partner Brett, and we love doing all kinds of magical things and buying cauldrons. We're a sucker for them. These events are really, really terrible for us because we always leave with way too many cauldrons. But as I said, I was born in Germany, specifically a region of Germany called the Harz Mountains. So I'm going to take you on a guided visualization of Germany to just show you where that is, because I didn't put it. No, I'm not. If you imagine Germany and you put your finger right on the middle of the map, that's pretty much where I was born, right in the centre there, pretty much of Europe and of Germany. I'm a member of the Welsh Language Coven, and very excitingly this year my first book's coming out as well, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later, but that's not for ages, so don't worry about it. So I'm talking specifically about dragon spirits, and this is the first time I'm doing this talk. I've talked about the subject a lot with friends, and when you mention dragons, there's this immediate image that comes up for people of these massive, scaly, flying creatures. You think George and the Dragon, or the dragons of Arthurian legend, up Dinas Emrys, these massive fire-breathing lizards. And belief in them has been around forever. When you talk about dragon spirits, people assume it's going to be spectral forms of these majestic beings. Unfortunately, and I hope it's not too disappointing, that is not at all what we're talking about here. The dragon spirits of German lore, whilst owing quite a lot to these traditional depictions of dragons, are quite a distinct kind of being. And they're very confined, interestingly, to sort of the Baltic and East German, particularly, regions. So hopefully I'm introducing you to something a little bit new today, because I absolutely adore it. But before we get properly into it, the historical context of the witch trials in Germany is really important to understanding these kind of witchcraft beliefs. So, as I'm sure most of you are aware, Germany had way more witch trials than any other country. In fact, conservative estimates suggest that about 50% of all witchcraft executions happened in Germany, or the German-speaking regions of the time. 20% of Europe's population lived in that area, but they accounted for 50% of all executions. They were disproportionately persecuting witches. In fact, most of the stereotypical ideas we have about the witchcraft trials and burning witches comes from the German and German language areas. So the idea is sort of burning witches and everything. That didn't really happen in England as much. That wasn't the execution method, but that was one that was used quite a lot in Germany. In fact, it was so notorious, there was so much witchcraft persecution going on that there's a Jesuit preacher called Friedrich Spee, who's famously quoted as describing Germany as the mother of so many of the witches, simply for the sheer amount of persecutions that took place there. And if you get a chance to look into Friedrich Spee, he's really interesting. He was a massive opponent of the witch trial. He escorted quite a lot of people who were accused of witchcraft through the trial and up to their execution. And he absolutely thought it was ridiculous. He was a massive early opponent, survived an assassination attempt because of his beliefs, just all around really interesting person. But what also makes Germany really interesting, and a big part of sort of why that was going on, is we've got the context of the 100 Years' War that's ravaged most of Europe. In about the 15th century, you've got the Black Death just before that, you've got the Protestant Reformation happening. So that area where I'm from, right in the heartland of Germany there, is also the birthplace of Martin Luther, who I shouldn't admit to this publicly, but who is one of my ancestors, incidentally. I can trace back history so far back right there in the Thüringen region. But you've got all these factors that are sort of coming together to create the witch trials as we know them. We can't really pin it down to any one thing. But we know that all of these things that are happening are creating a lot of poverty. There's a lot of widowed people in the wake of the 100 Years' War. There's a lot of people, a lot more people than ever before, having to rely on charity, having to go door to door and beg. Now, for centuries, that was a part of community life. You had the people who couldn't support themselves. They would go farmstead to farmstead. They'd ask for help. They'd ask maybe to sleep in the barn for a dispensation of food. And the community would take care of these individuals. But all of a sudden, there's more people requiring help than maybe the community can possibly afford to help. And also you've got people taking advantage of the idea of charity, community charity, and you've got people who are asking for more than they need, and you've got this sort of weird tension starting to build up economically that contributes to the witch trials, but also contributes to ideas around dragon spirits, which is why it's a bit relevant to bring up early. So Germany, really interesting, a lot of poverty, a lot of weird stuff going on, and a strong community vibe. But there's also one of my favourite subjects, a load of magical treasure hunting. So treasure hunting for centuries was not metal detectors in the field, it wasn't archaeologists, it was magicians. For the longest of times, treasure was the thing that magicians sought for, which kind of was the show we've always been for, because we've always needed to find it. And it really did make up a disproportionate amount of magic. There's a phenomenal book actually about it that's called Magical Treasure Hunting in Europe and North America, which is an academic book that really goes into that, but it's incredible the amount of sources, the amount of information we actually have about that practice. And one thing I love about it is that grimoires were a huge part of magical treasure hunting. So the idea was that these magical manuscripts that had been handed down would give a magician the ability to divine where treasure would be hidden. But the idea was that they were incredibly difficult to translate and understand. So you'd have teams of people who wanted to find treasure, and they would have to hire a magician who could read and translate magical books. So while we've always been poor, we've also always been obsessed with books. It's a really time-honored tradition. But what makes the treasure even more interesting, that starts to bleed into ideas of spirits associated with treasure, is that as part of that magical treasure hunt, treasure itself was believed to be sentient. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Discworld series by Tim Pratchett, but if you think about the luggage in the Discworld, that's how I imagine these magical treasures to be. So you've got a chest or some other kind of treasure that can move of its own accord, that's sentient, that you can communicate with to some level. But if you're not worthy or not magical enough, and you stumble upon the treasure, it can vanish. It can go completely. And so not only are magicians essential in helping find the treasure, they're also essential in negotiating with the treasure and making sure the treasure actually stays there so that you can gain financial benefit from it. There's also a really important and interesting idea that saints could be a part of the magical treasure hunting. So saints were really, really popular in the early modern period. They're really popular today, and the cult of saints have a very long history. And one of the most popular saints when it comes to treasure hunting is Saint Christopher, patron saint of lost things. But I don't find him the most interesting one associated with magical treasure. There's another one, and she plays into what I think is one of the most powerful things about witchcraft. So I come from quite a strict, high-controlling, fundamentalist Christian background, but I came to witchcraft later in life after I got out of that. And so to me, one of the most powerful and enlightening and liberating things about witchcraft is that it allows us to immerse ourselves in symbolism and interpretation. So in a strict Protestant culture, you've got no chance of engaging with symbolism, of being allowed to interpret things for yourself. But I love that as pagans and witches, we can approach source material, we can approach things like the saints sometimes, even if you're comfortable with that, and find new ways of engaging and relating with them, and even interpreting them. And Saint Corona is an amazing example of that. Maybe not amazing might be the wrong word actually when I explain it, but she was the patron saint of treasure, of gamblers, really interesting, associated with all things money. So her name, Corona, comes from a word for crown, so it's because her name related to the currency of the time, the krone or the crowns, that she sort of got that association with money, and she would often be invoked in order to find magical treasure. What's really interesting though is the idea of reinterpretation. There was a massive global world event recently that had a word like corona in it. And all of a sudden, Saint Corona became really popular again. And though she never historically had any association, suddenly she's being invoked as a patron saint of pandemics and invoked against pandemics that might be happening because of that name link. So we're not the only ones doing the reinterpreting. The people who actually have saints built into their religion did a whole lot of that recently, and I think that's a lovely way that we can approach these kinds of sources and materials and find some value in them. But what struck me when I was learning a little about the saints is that when they were conjured in treasure hunting, so Christopher and Corona mostly, they were treated remarkably similarly to the way ceremonial magicians might treat demons. In fact, it's noteworthy, the academics pick up on it, that they were conjured up, but they were very carefully banished afterwards as well. They did not want them to stick around. So this idea that the spirits you negotiate with in order to find treasure, they can be really dangerous. Even if they're saints, even if they're supposed to be good and godly beings, they were very, very carefully banished. The peace of God was often invoked, but not as sort of, oh, this lovely, happy peace of God that sort of joins us together. The peace of God was the thing that stopped the saint getting to you. It was the barrier between you and the saint, that the peace of God would be between you. And so, when people negotiated with spirits in order to find treasure, these spirits could be very dangerous, and you wanted to keep them away from you after the treasure had been found. But again, sort of tying this idea of treasure hunting back into the Christian worldview of the time, is the idea that treasure hunting and money magic wasn't really that condemned. So when you compare what happened in Germany to the witches, like thousands upon thousands executed, people who searched for treasure using magic would have far more lenient punishments brought against them generally, and whether that be a fine, a short stay in prison, those kind of things, rather than being executed. And a big part of that was that it was seen, or at least cleverly portrayed, as a Christian duty. That the spirits that guarded these treasures could sometimes be the spirits of deceased people. And this again comes into the idea of how people negotiated with money at the time, that people who amassed a huge amount of treasure and money in their lifetime and never put it to any good use, that they had wasted their life, that they'd done something awful and terrible, and that they could not move on into their eternal rest as long as that treasure remained built up. That the pursuit of money for money's sake was a terrible thing that would trap you in this world, and that only if someone then found your treasure and put it to good use could you move on and pass on to heaven. So a big part of sort of magicians negotiating to find these treasures was communicating with the spirits of the dead and the deceased who wanted their treasures to be found so that they could then pass on, which is a really interesting thing. I'm sure there was some careful marketing going on there to make sure that this was an okay way of doing magic. And another... He's really good at his job, I love it.
Not paying me enough.
He's actually an author, soon to be, so he's had a huge demotion today. I'm really grateful he's doing it for me. But another really important part of sort of this, I know I'm going on a lot about treasure and money and magic. It's all really relevant, I promise, and hopefully by the end of it you'll see why I'm chatting so much about it. But another really big part, an important part of these ideas around treasure and negotiating with money at this time when there's so much poverty in Europe, when people are really struggling is the idea of the Eilbaum and the Gman Line. So you might know that's the mandrake, that's the more popular name here. So the Eilbaum in particular is the German name for mandrake, and that would be very much like the traditional mandrake. So a lot of folklore grew around it about how it might grow from the semen of a hanged man, and you have to go and gather it and nurture it with your own blood and that kind of thing, and then it would generate money for you. So money would appear in the little chest where you kept the mandrake, or around the mandrake every day, a certain amount of money. So it was a source of perpetual wealth, but not an extravagant amount of wealth either. So it wasn't making you rich, but it was making sure that you didn't have to worry about money. The Gman Line is a really fun sort of German variation where it's not necessarily the mandrake room, but it can be any kind of doll. So it's an inspirited doll. Sometimes they were pig or sheep ladders, sometimes they were made of wax. So it translates essentially to Little Money Man or Money Mannequin. And it serves a very similar role. It can be made from a wide variety of materials. So if you're struggling to find a mandrake, there's a precedent for using essentially a pocket to do the exact same thing. And they'd often be sold, bought and sold, and again, they provided you with money. What's really interesting about the Gman Line is that would be kept in the money chest of the family, because obviously bank accounts didn't exist at the time. So it was almost the guardian of what we today would consider a bank account. And its job was to make sure your bank account never emptied. So if you're thinking of a fun way to maybe use that today, a pocket that presides over your bank account, makes sure it never empties and always has enough money for you to live, certainly has a historical precedent. The interesting thing about them, though, is there's still this weird tension where even though they're a positive thing and people seek them out, especially the poor, there's this idea that they can still damn your soul. There's still something that before you die you need to get rid of. So you keep it and make sure you're comfortable up until sort of you're starting to realize, oh, I'm going on a bit, aren't I? Maybe I should think about what's next. And at that point, people would often sell their mandrake or sell their Gman Line, and they'd always sell it for far, far less than it was worth. Which again brings in that economic dimension of the magic, that to get rid of this thing that might just curse you a little bit, you have to do the opposite of the economic activity it provided. So if it provided you wealth, you have to sell it for extremely cheap or give it away in order to be rid of it. You couldn't make a profit from that sale, or it wouldn't work. So that's a bit of the context of the world in which we encounter the dragon spirits. And in German they're known as the Drache or the Drache, which basically translates directly to dragon. There's some theories I've read that the Drache might come from mandrake, that's how that spirit works in. I'm not sure, I don't think that quite works. I think there's a lot of draconic, I don't know, elements to it that seem to imply that that's a better way for it to get its name. But it's essentially, in Germany, there's a huge tradition of household spirits that exist within the household and form different functions. They have certain purposes for their being there. The Drache takes the form of a very long serpent with a massive bulbous head. That's about the best description we have of it. You can imagine whatever you want outside of that. There's so many different descriptions, but the key things generally are it's a flying serpent with a massive, massive head, a bit like me, which is always described as being the biggest part of it. Sometimes, but this is later, they sort of start to get conflated with other kinds of spirits and they start to take other animal forms or even human form. But generally, when we look back at the oldest sources, it's this flying snake, which essentially is what the earliest dragons were too, but without the flying top again. They would access the homes through the chimney, or sometimes, rarely, an open window. They didn't breathe fire, but they had sparks and flames all across their body, and they had this strong association with comets and meteors. So if you imagine the way they've been described as looking, and the way they fly through the sky, there's a lot of associations with comets that through streaks in the sky. They've got the glowing bright bit at the front, a massive head, and then the long tail stretching down. So that's one of the explanations that have been given for sightings of this spirit, is that they were comets or meteors flying through the sky, or smog above villages, or just spirits, because we're allowed to believe in that too. But as as I said, this spirit was really wrapped into the witch trials in Germany. It really got dragged into that. So it existed before the witch trials, but when they came along, it was this handy foil and scapegoat ready to, I guess, be used by the prosecutions. But it wasn't just the prosecutions, it was society itself. It was from within the community that accusations of having a dragon spirit generally came, which is really interesting when we get towards the end of this talk. So one of the trials we have is Margareta Herning from 1580, and she's really interesting. So she's a woman on her own, and she's very affluent, she's very wealthy, she owns vineyards, she has servants, but she constantly complains about how poor she is. She's constantly, I've got no money, even though her lifestyle proves that she's very wealthy. She's very concerned with her money and her wealth and accumulating more of it. She's so concerned with her wealth that when guests come to her home and she offers them hospitality, she has her servants clear the food from the table before they finish to make sure they don't have too much, which is a massive violation of hospitality in German culture at that time. I mean, I'd be quite upset today, honestly, if someone took food from my table. But there's this idea that she's very wealthy, tends to be poor, and she's very concerned with keeping her wealth to herself and making sure no one else gets a piece of that. And she finds herself wrapped up in having an accusation of having a dragon spirit that explains why she's so wealthy and why she's so obsessed with that as well. There's another one from 1611, the widow Ecksteinin. Her husband as well, when he was alive, was at least thought to have the dragon spirit. They were thought to be a team that they moved to a very large house, which sort of signaled that they'd gone up in the social class. But they still pled poverty. They always had more than they should have, which is sort of recurring theme in these trial accusations. They will believe that to summon a fog through the dragon spirit, and in the fog steal the grain from their neighbours, and then sell all their produce at a highly marked up price. So that was also one thing that often got that accusation thrown at you, is if you had more than you should have. There's loads of trial records where so-and-so has more cheese than they should have, so-and-so has more, I wish I had more cheese. But if you have more than you should have, or that your lifestyle says you should have, you're very likely to have an accusation of having a dragon spirit leveled at you, especially if you're miserly with your wealth and that. So for example, the widow Ecksteinin, she really found herself accused when she refused family members a small loan that she could easily afford. When she refused to help her family, never mind her community, that's when those accusations started coming. And there's one more, Hans Adam Gemeitz, who I find really fascinating because this sort of sums it up to me. He made his living knitting socks. My partner's a crocheter, I know how much effort goes into it, but it would never have made him rich. And in fact, a few years before the trial was brought against him, he was begging for help because he was in such poverty. But all of a sudden, he became unreasonably wealthy, bought a large house, he was giving out loans to all of the community amounting to 100 florins, which was a lot of money. And no one could work out, how's he suddenly so rich? He knit stocks, he's not doing anything else, he doesn't got land or anything. They conveniently ignored the fact his godfather was a counterfeiter and decided he must have a dragon spirit. And there's a lot of crossover, loads of crossover. So one of the most feared types of witches in Germany was the milk witch. The witch who could steal the milk from your cows from afar, who could make your dairy produce go off, who would steal your cheese. There's a lot of crossover between the milk witches and the dragon witches in that the dragons would often steal the milk, steal the cheese, steal your money. They'd steal anything on behalf of the witch. So there's this recurring thought that the dragon spirit, particularly in the trials, steals money, milk, other saleable goods from people in the community, brings them back to the witch. That the witch is someone who is very concerned with self-enrichment, who is not community-minded at all, very individualistic, and just wants to make themselves rich. And that they're very happy to do that at the expense of the community. So there's always ideas of either they're inflating their prices, so they're charging more than they should, or they're quite literally stealing produce from their neighbours. So they're cutting into the fields of the neighbours or taking from the cows of the neighbours. So it's that very aggressive economic behaviour that often would get you caught in those trials. And this is where the idea of the dragon as the devil starts to creep in a bit as well. I mean, it's an easy target in the Bible. The dragon is sometimes referred to as a devil, and wherever there's dragons, accusations of devilry are not far behind. That's why they often play the part of the villain in all of the stories we know. And pretty much all of the early modern authors agreed that the Drache was a demon or a dragon of some sort that was corrupting the community. The very first witch trial in Saxony that invoked the idea of an incubus or a succubus involved a Drache. So the idea was that the witch who had the Drache would fly into her home, he would put all the produce on the table, he'd transform into a stunningly handsome young man, and then they would do the deed and he'd resume the form of a dragon and fly off again. And one that just sort of takes that to the next level for me is a 1652 trial where one individual decided to make an accusation against the community. I'm not sure what she had been seeing, but she claimed that a Drache took the form of, again, a handsome young man, levitated into midair in the middle of the village, and a load of the local village women levitated into midair with him, did the deed, floated back down, just in full view of everyone. And yeah, it's an early version of some websites nowadays. That
Sounds like our average Saturday night.
but it's really interesting because this isn't an uncommon thing either to happen to folkloric beings. So we know that Drache exists in folklore and gets turned into a demon. It happens all the time. I won't time in too much because I'm aware of time, but there's some really interesting trials where beings like Frau Holle, the German goddess, are sort of involved in the witchcraft trial, and suddenly, after torture, this benevolent goddess becomes the devil. So it happens quite frequently, unfortunately. But the dragon of folklore, we'll go through that quick, has this strong association with fire. It looks the same as the dragon of the witch trials, it's just a bit more chill, really. It's, again, the long snake that flies like a comet. It's will burn your house down if it's not fixed, so maybe not quite that chill. It is often passed down along families, sort of bringing in the idea that if someone has this demonic attachment, as they would have understood it then, not being that familiar with household spirits, that they can't pass on if they have that attachment, so they have to pass it on to the family. So a lot of the folklore concerns people who have a dragon coming to the end of their life, calling their family to them and asking, please can someone take this and be rich, and then pass it on to your kids. They often hid in the spokes of wagon wheels, and that's a lot more interesting than you think it is, because essentially the wagon wheels back in the day in Germany were the equivalent of money under the mattress. If someone had a bit of spare change they didn't want anyone to find, or they wanted to keep for a rainy day, they'd hide it in the wheel spokes. And so again, you've got this idea of the dragon being present wherever money is, or knowing where to steal the money from. So the equivalent nowadays is the dragon hiding under your mattress rooting for your spare change, or your sofa, I guess. And the folklore of the dragon is really, again, prevalent in Eastern Germany and the Baltic regions. But what's really interesting, why we can pretty much categorically say that this is older folklore co-opted by the witch trials, is in the Baltic regions, we haven't found a single witch trial that invokes the Drache spirit. Not a single one. That's exclusive to the Eastern German areas. So we know the folklore exists in both places, but only one made use of that in order to draw it into the witch trials quite as much. And then, how can you get one? Because let's face it, by now we all want one. Because it goes out, it gets you money. We'll ignore all the terrible things that can happen to you. But again, passed down in families, they can be bought, they're traded like a commodity, or they can be conjured in various ways. So one of the most popular ways of conjuring the devil in early modern Germany was to steal communion bread. So the idea was that when you go and take the sacrament in church, and the priest puts the bread in your mouth, it's transformed into the body of Christ. If you keep it under your tongue, you're stealing the body of Christ. That's a massive sin. It's a massive heresy to do that. So to steal the communion bread was a massive act of rebellion. And oftentimes people, and this happened in English familiar law as well, people would steal the communion bread and then feed it to their familiar in order to seal that pact with the familiar. So that's a really common motif. I wouldn't even be sure why to get communion bread these days, but I'd like to try it. One really important thing about the dragon is their hiding place has to be kept secret. If you reveal their hiding place, they'll leave, they'll burn your house down, they'll take all their wealth with them. So it's something people don't talk about. I'm sure that has something to do with self-preservation as well, considering the other things that are involved. They're often seen streaking through the sky, and because they're often seen streaking through the sky and people claim to see the dragons quite regularly, there's a lot of folklore about how you can get the dragon to drop what they're holding. And this is my favourite part of the folklore, because the Germans don't hold back. To get a dragon to drop its treasure, whatever it's carrying, you need to shock it out of the sky. And the way to do that is you go and stand outdoors, you drop your trousers, and you expose your buttocks. And the shock will be so intense that whatever the dragon is carrying, it will drop immediately. So we've got all sorts of folklore where people do that exact thing. The dragon drops a load of peas and fills a well, and they can feed their livestock for however many years. But that comes with a downside as well, which is if you set out, you expose your buttocks to the dragon and you shock it, but you're not stood under any kind of cover or a porch, then instead of dropping its treasure, the dragon will shit on you. And the folklore is very, very clear that you will not be rid of that smell for the rest of your days. So there is an element of risk. So the next time you see a comet and you expose yourself to it, make sure you're stood under a porch or something. This is my favourite picture. Anyway. So as I've mentioned or made reference to a couple of times, familiar beliefs were really popular in Britain. There's a brilliant book about familiar beliefs, Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirit by Emma Wilby, which sort of looks into how fairy familiars and demon familiars had a lot in common and how we can sort of look at those beliefs as sort of a whole. The Drache, I like to claim it's a familiar, but it doesn't really fit the mold at all, really. It brings things to its master, but it doesn't feed. So Jonathan made reference to a third nipple before. That's a common part of familiar belief, that someone who has a familiar must feed that familiar of themselves from their witch's teeth or from some other sort, usually of their own blood. The Drache doesn't need to be fed from the witch. It brings things to the witch. It doesn't give any advice, it doesn't cast any judgments, it just does its job and functions in that way more akin to a traditional household spirit. So when we think about household spirits, particularly in German law, but it kind of is a bit more universal, there's two predominant types. You've got the anthropomorphic household spirits, so you've got the ones that resemble humans, who might be the spirit of the house. So in German you're thinking kobold, for example, who's a bit more human-like, is the spirit of the place and makes sure that the house is in order. And most people in the house are sort of a little bit reverent to the anthropomorphic household spirit. The master of the house isn't really the master, it's the spirit. And if the spirit doesn't like what's going on in the house, it will make sure it stops. The theriomorphic household spirits, those who sort of take the form of animals, akin to the Drache, they're a bit different. They don't generally get involved in the affairs of the house. They're a little impartial, they're not casting moral judgment. They just do what you want, make sure the house runs a bit better, bring you a bit of money, a bit of food. They're more akin to helpers around the house that just quietly get on with whatever it is you want them to get on with, as long as you keep your end of the deal, which in the case of the Drache, keep its place a secret and make sure it has a bit of food. And considering it's bringing you food, just give it a little bit of what it's bringing you and you'll be fine. So generally speaking, I think we can get away with calling the Drache a familiar. It's a spirit in a pact with a witch, but technically, and to be very precise about it, it sort of falls more into the idea of a household spirit. But when we take that all together, and consider we're at the Wild Witchcraft Conference, this is why I've been going on about economic behaviour so much. The idea of the Drache can be interpreted a lot of ways. Again, it's what I love about witchcraft. We can approach these symbols, we can approach the ideas and interpret them how we want. But one of the more popular interpretations of the Drache spirit is as an early anti-capitalism belief. It's a way to punish economically aggressive worldviews. So it's people who want more, who want more, who want more, who are selling stuff at ridiculously marked up prices, who are suddenly in possession of wealth they have no realistic way of being in possession of and getting ahead of their social status, but neglecting their obligations to the community. So it's not just about enriching yourself, that's kind of okay. It's about enriching yourself at the expense of others, and also then detaching yourself from the community and the community obligations you have. So those ideas we were talking about earlier of people who would go from house to house asking for a little bit of help and money. If someone was wealthy and they didn't offer that help, that was a violation of that social contract that had built into the social order. So you've got this tension between these emerging sort of capitalistic beliefs where people are thinking, well, why not me? Why not enrich myself a bit more? Why not bump my prices up a little bit? Sure, they're starving, but that doesn't matter if I've got enough money to eat for a year. And the idea of the community doesn't matter as much as myself and my enrichment. That sort of seems to be the bedrock of where this belief gets caught up into the witchcraft trials and turned into a way of sanctioning that kind of economic behaviour. Because it's never aimed at the poor, it's always aimed at those who are suddenly above their station and not helping out. And that's not really on the spirit itself either, it's the motivation of the individual. It's why we just talked a little bit about what a household spirit is. They do as they're told. They enter into that negotiation with the witch and then they do whatever they're instructed to do. So those people who were very individualistic, who were obsessed with self-enrichment, who were very economically aggressive and seemed to threaten those community bonds, they were the people that would get caught up in these accusations very specifically. And social views of those individuals were not good. People did not like this proto-capitalistic thought at the time, to the point where in the folklore, we read so many accounts of people who have a dracha spirit who don't pass it on. They can't die. They just languish, suffering, until someone puts them on a dung heap. And only once they're on the dung heap can they actually pass on. That's the level of thought people had about these individuals. They were the lowest of the low. And so we have this idea that from a society focused on community, a society with loads of problems, let's not idealize it, but they didn't want this economically aggressive approach getting into their community. They wanted to see people fairly compensated. They wanted to make sure that people weren't inflating their prices, like we've seen ridiculously across the last few years. That every single corporation that exists in this country would have been accused of having a dracha pretty much after the inflation we've seen over the last few years. Just ridiculous amounts of increases of price. And that is one of the ways I like to interpret this belief, is a way of thinking about community and of thinking of those bonds that we have between each other. That when we're doing well, that's an opportunity for us to be together to help others out, to lift each other up. When we're not doing so well, when we have community that we can rely on, we can help each other out. It's a great gift of paganism and witchcraft. So many of us, I'm sure, have had conversations this morning about how lovely it is to be back together at the start of sort of the conference season and to just be in community. And to me, that's one of the great lessons of the dracha, is to really relish in that community and to not threaten that community with the aggressive economic ideas that the dracha was used sort of to warn against a little. But that doesn't mean that the dracha is a bad thing or a bad spirit. Like I've tried to say a little, the dracha does as it's ordered. The dracha has a specific role and function, and in a lot of the folklore, it takes only a little. Very similar to how the poor would beg and go from farm to farm to farm and be handed a little from each farmer so as not to be a burden on any one. The dracha oftentimes would go to 100 villages and take a little from each so that the person who kept the dracha could be fed. Because they had no other option, they had no other hope. It's only when people started to get greedy and go, no, go take everything, go take all of the milk from my neighbour, go take all of the grain from the farm down the road, that this started to become a problem. But I also love the idea that the dracha spirit, because spirits are great, and we can work with spirits, and the dracha spirit is capable of magical theft. It's capable of redistribution of wealth. And we're living in a time now in society when wealth is ridiculously unfairly distributed. The poor are poorer, the rich are richer. There's a way of interpreting the dracha as a magical Robin Hood. of sending this spirit out against those who do deserve it. Not against your community, your neighbours and your friends, but against those who really deserve it and who wouldn't even notice. If £1 billion went out of their bank account, wouldn't notice, wouldn't bat an eyelid. I think that's quite a nice way of looking at it. And there's a few ways to work with that spirit in that vein. There's also the idea of sort of the energetic exchange which comes with the dark. It doesn't have to be a spirit necessarily that goes out to get you money or that gets you food. It can be something that replenishes you when you're really struggling, when you're depleted, and you just need that little pick me up. There's a spirit you can send out that can gather that for you, that can just allow you to take the rest you need and be rejuvenated. And again, I think it's a lovely spirit that we can reinterpret, much as St. Corona is reinterpreted, as a familiar, as a household spirit in the form of other household spirits. The dragon is just one spirit amongst many who serve a household. And it's absolutely bloody cool, I think. I think it's so incredible that there's this spirit that is a dragon that flies through the sky and goes down people's chimneys and brings you stuff that you need and you keep it in a kettle. That's really cool. I mean, and it exists in one tiny little corner of the world. But if that resonates with you, and you can interpret that as a familiar spirit, have a dragon familiar. Who's stopping you? They exist. Dragon spirits exist. They have for centuries. People have believed in them for centuries. And if a dragon familiar reveals itself to you, don't question it, because they're here, and we can prove it. Academically, spiritually, pagan-y, in whatever way you want. They're here, they're cool, they're awesome. And I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope I haven't bored you too much. And I hope you've learned a little bit of something about the German dragon spirits. Thank you very much.
When I turn off my alarm, that's when I get the incense burning, 'cause I'll try to do no harm. I'll leave my door and keep my eyes trained on the ground on which I walk. Hope no one sees me on the subway, because I'm not trying to talk. I'll get my coffee, I'm an addict now. It's not something I'm worried about. I'm worried about the grandest schemes and everything tomorrow brings. I'm trying to be a good dude, but I'm just not sure what that really means. I see demons when I close my eyes, hear angels and I let them sing like ooh, ah, ooh, 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 ooh. They say ooh. Restless in the evening when I'm laying down to bed. Things didn't all turn out exactly like I had them in my head. I'm worried about this life I'm living, yeah, but changing can be hard. I've got these expectations on me and they've taken me this far. Say a prayer about the morning, I pray it brings some kind of hope. This life does not come with a warning, the point does not come with a joke. Pray that you find what you're looking for, and maybe on the way you can tell me where you found it, and we'll meet back there someday and we'll say, ooh, who knew, who knew, who knew? We'll say, ooh, yeah, who knew, yeah, who knew? She said, don't worry, you're doing fine, just take each day one step at a time. You mean the best, I see it when I look inside your teary eyes. Said don't worry, you're doing fine, just take each day one step at a time. You mean the best, I see it when I look inside your teary eyes. Said don't worry, you're doing fine, just take each day one step at a time. You mean the best, I see it when I look inside your teary eyes. Said don't worry, you're doing fine, just take each day one step at a time. You mean the best, I see it when I look inside your teary eyes. Say ooh, thank you, thank you, thank you. I say ooh, yeah, thank you, yeah, thank you, yeah, thank you. in the morning when I turn off my alarm. That's when I get the incense burning, 'cause I'll try to do no harm.
The Buried Moon, a folktale from North Lancashire. Once upon a time, long ago when the world was young and people still heard the voices of the trees, the marshes were a world of waters swirling around tree roots. Vast pools of black water, black as a scrying mirror, creeping, bubbling streams of green water, gentle, clear puddles rippling with life, and deep, muddy mools that shaped and squished and slumped if you stood on them. The moon, Lady Luna, silver shiner, as she does now, hung high in the sky and shone and shone and shone. And that silver light shone on all the bog pools so that you could walk through them as safely as you could walk during the day. But when she didn't shine, the marshes were dark and dangerous, dim and dingy. All of the things that lurk and dwell in the dark and shadows, things with dark thoughts, doing dark deeds, and wishing harm, came creeping and crawling out. One evening, the moon heard this as a grandmother told her daughter to be careful and avoid the marshes at night, giving her a silver blade to protect herself if she needed it. The moon was troubled by this, being kind and good, giving up her night of rest to shine for us all night long. She fretted and waxed with worry. She decided, in the way we all have to decide sometime in our lives, that she would have to see this for herself. At the end of the month, she wrapped her shining body in a thick black cloak and pulled a deep black hood over her glowing hair, and she stepped down from the star-sprinkled sky to the water's edge. There was water to the north and to the south of her, water to the east and the west, swirling and bubbling and pooling, black spiky branches twisting and bending, and all around her was dark, a deep, swirling, hungry darkness. The only light came from the sprinkling of star reflections on the water's surface and the soft glow of her own pale feet peeking out from the bottom of her cloak. She was nervous, trembling. She pulled her cloak tight around her, but she pressed on, determined to see everything that could be seen. She stepped from tuft of grass to stepping stone between the greedy, gurgling waters. She moved lightly and easily, but then she slipped, tumbled and fell. She fell towards the biggest, darkest pool of water. Quickly, she reached out and grabbed a snag, a dying tree branch, and as she held it with her bright, pale fingers, it twisted and shifted, gripping her by the wrist until she was stuck fast and couldn't move. No matter how she pulled or twisted or struggled, it made no difference. She stood there, restricted for the first time, and she trembled. She searched the darkness, looking for any sign of help. There was no one around. But then she heard, softly, at first, a calling and calling and calling that turned to a crying and a weeping and a sobbing. As it grew louder and closer, she also heard a squish, squish, squish of one foot following another through the marshes, until the soft light peeking through her cloak hit upon the pale face and wide eyes of a man lost in the marshes. And as he saw the flicker of her light across the dark waters, he moved closer, drawn in the hope that he'd found safety. The moon, seeing him walk closer to the deepest, darkest pool, shook and twisted herself until her hood fell back, and away from her shining hair and her bright face, the beautiful light radiating from her drove away the darkness around and between them, and all the evil lurking things fled away into the nooks and crannies and dark corners of the marshes. The man was overjoyed to see the light and to take in his surroundings. By her bright light, he could get his bearings. He could see the paths through the danger, and therefore his way home. He was so excited, so relieved to be free of the quicks, rights, and boggles that he turned homeward, fixed his eyes there, and ran, not once looking back to see where the brave light had come from. He saw nothing of her shining silver hair spilling from her cloak down to the water below. And the moon, well, she was so focused on saving him and so delighted to see him back on the right path that she didn't think once of herself or her need to be rescued, prisoner though she was of the dark snag and the even darker waters. As he became a pale dot in the distance, she reclaimed her own needs and knew she must follow him, that she wished to be by his side on that path. So she pulled and twisted and fought with all of her might, but couldn't move an inch. Finally, she collapsed, defeated at the base of the snag, the hood once more falling forward and covering her light. Everything went dark and still. And then, from the darkness, all the evil things returned, hissing and howling, skulking and crawling, mocking and sniping, recognizing their enemy whose life so often spoiled their plans. They spat and growled at her as she crouched defeated, wishing she had never stepped down from the sky. And just as the evil things squabbled about what they should do with her, a sliver of golden light threaded its way across the horizon, and a pale light began to fill the sky as the dawn came and the sun returned. Before they fled, though, they gabbled and pushed and pulled the moon with bony fingers down into the waters. The boggles banded together and dragged some strange, huge stone and rolled it atop her to keep her from rising. And there she lay, buried, hidden, silent, in the dark. The days passed, and it came to the time for the new moon. And when people looked up at the sky, no moon came, even though they put pennies in their pockets and straws in their hats to be ready for her. They looked to the sky and looked, for the moon was a good friend to them and always had been. But the moon never came. The nights were all dark, and the evil things were everywhere in those twilight hours. The people of the marshes were all worried and afraid, and they missed the moon and her light. A group of them went to the wise woman who lived in an old tumble-down mill at the edge of the village and asked her where the moon had gone. She cast water into a bowl and looked for the moon, but saw nothing. She threw herbs into the fire and looked, but couldn't see the moon. She closed her eyes and walked deep into her inner grove, but still saw nothing. So she sent them out into the world to search for information from those who had gazed at the moon before she disappeared. And so they went place to place, asking all who they met when they had last seen the moon. In fields, by ponds, and in the woods, they walked and talked of the moon. Until one evening, gathered around the roaring fire of a pub, talk and tales of the moon drew the attention of a young man in the corner. He sat up, slapped his knee, set down his pipe, and spoke. "My faith, I had forgotten, but some nights ago, I think the moon saved my life, and I know where she must be." And he told them the story of his rescue in the dark. So they took him to the wise woman, keeper of Druid wisdom. She once more looked into the scrying bowl, to the hearth flames, and her inner grove, and this time, knowing where to look, she nodded. "It's dark where she is, darker than you can imagine. I cannot fully see, but you will see for yourselves. Go, before the night falls, put a stone in your mouth and take a hazel twig in your hand, and do not speak a word until you are safely home again. Walk far into the middle of the marsh until you find a coffin, a cross, and a candle. There you'll find the moon and can free her." So that very night they went together, each with a stone in their mouth and a hazel branch in their hand. Afraid, but brave, they walked into the dark. They wandered and stumbled through the marshes, not seeing any creatures, but hearing strange sounds in the shadows. Then suddenly they saw the signs the wise woman had foretold. There was a great stone jutting out of the water, shaped just like a coffin, and above it the black snag of a broken branch stretched out its arms like a cross. And there, below, there was a tiny light flickering in the deep waters. They wanted to call out, but they remembered what they'd been told and held the stones firm on their tongues. And they moved the stone away, using all of their strength to heave it clear and to let it sink into another part of the waters. And they separated and pushed aside the branches of the snag. And they would later tell how they saw for a moment a bright, shining face rising up out of the water, and then, as they stepped back, the marsh was bathed in silver light, and suddenly the moon was back in the sky, full, bright, and as beautiful and kind as ever. And the marshes and paths were illuminated and clear, and the light crept to every corner to keep the darkness and boggles away as long as she could. And they crept home, silent and steady and thankful, as she smiled down on them, and smiled, and smiles still. My own adaptation there of The Buried Moon, a North Lincolnshire folktale originally collected by Mrs. Balfour from a little girl called Bratton, who said she had been often told the tale by her grandmother. Several versions have appeared over the years, including Joseph Jacobs' version collected in More English Folktales.
Oh, that was amazing. Following Moss's talk, you heard a brilliant song by Alex McHugh and the group activity called Incense, and that went into The Buried Moon, a folktale sent in by John Nash. More great music, and it is also so nice to have a story back on the show. If you're a poet, storyteller or musician and would like your work played on the show, send it over to me at podcast@druidry.org. As it's only a monthly show, I can't play everything I'm sent, but I will always do my best to bring your work to a wide listening audience. Well, my friends, that is a show, but before I go, let's have the results of last month's competition. The prize was a signed copy of the Taliesin sourcebook, and the question I asked was, what is the meaning of the name Taliesin? Well, the answer is shining or radiant brow. And the first name drawn from the hat and winner of that brilliant book is, drumroll please, Gary Neal from Maryland, USA. Congratulations, Gary. That book will be with you very soon. The prize this month is a copy of Moss's book, which is called An Apostate's Guide to Witchcraft, Finding Freedom Through Magic, and it's due out in October, so we have pre-ordered a copy for the winner of this month's competition. And the question I'd like you to answer is, Moss's talk was primarily about dragon spirits from which European country? Moss's talk was primarily about dragon spirits from which European country? Oh man, so easy this month, so there's no excuse. Email your answer along with your full postal address to podcast@druidry.org, and one of you will win that brilliant book when it is released in October. But that brings us to the end of episode 205. I will see you next month for episode 206. But until then, I wish you all, as ever, peace and blessed be. Goodbye.